During a public health crisis, reporters view themselves as watchdogs, and they tend to view health officials with great skepticism. As one journalist put it, quote, "They are the enemy because they are between us and the truth and the public and the truth." How do nurse leaders overcome this perception? It is paramount that nurse leaders are perceived as honest and trustworthy at all times. The following guidelines will help you achieve this goal as nurse leaders. Proactive, upfront disclosure is almost always a better media strategy than reactive after-the-fact disclosure. By proactively disclosing information to the press and the public, you are demonstrating that you have nothing to hide, that you are being honest and upfront about the problem, and that you are doing everything you possibly can to protect patients and the public. For example, in 2015, Santa Clara Valley Medical Center in San Jose, California, discovered that 350 infants may have been exposed to a nurse infected with tuberculosis. The hospital proactively disclosed the incident to the public, minimizing news coverage of the event. During the 2014 Ebola scare, Valley Medical Center also invited the press for a tour of the hospital.
At the time, we felt it was better, let's just show the public what we would do so that they can have confidence that if this happens, which at that, as we all know afterwards, that was really more scare than anything else, that we had the ability to admit a patient safely through a select doorway, bring them in, and what was the process, that they would gown up, they showed them in PPE attire, and it becomes less frightening to the public if they know there's a means to do this and that we're prepared to do it. And so, transparency is half of getting through the fear.
During the Ebola news story of 2014, Texas Health Presbyterian Hospital was forced to backtrack from misstatements which fueled media mistrust and public fear. For example, Texas Health Presbyterian Hospital officials wrongly claimed that a nurse failed to record the travel history of Thomas Duncan, the first patient diagnosed with Ebola in America who had traveled from Liberia where he was exposed to the disease.
That nurse was part of a care team, and it was a complex care team taking care of him in the emergency department. Regretfully, that information was not fully communicated throughout the full team. And as a result, the full import of that information wasn't factored into the clinical decision-making.
When it became clear that the nurse had in fact recorded Duncan's travel history, the hospital then claimed there was an electronic health record error, which also proved to be incorrect. This is why it is paramount to convey accurate information to the media at all times.
One of the most important things is that you have your facts correct. What you don't want to happen is to be asked something that you really should have the data for and you don't. So you need to be prepared to have data you should have. And if you do provide data, you need to make sure it's the most current data because data quickly becomes out of date. So that's really important that you have all that factual information straight.
I have no doubt that we'll stop this in its tracks in the U.S.
When CDC Director Tom Frieden proclaimed he was, quote, stopping Ebola in its tracks, his public assurances appeared to be contradicted when 2 nurses subsequently became infected with the disease. This is why it's important to avoid overassurance during a public health crisis, because not only could you be proven wrong after the fact, but the public will become more frightened. During the Ebola scare of 2014, officials wrongly accused nurses of medical record errors and irresponsible travel, prompting protests and rallying cries that nurses were being scapegoated during the crisis. These erroneous accusations damaged officials' credibility with the press, which in turn fueled more public fear and panic. As one journalist stated, quote, "If your organization has done something bad, put it out as quickly as you can. Do it practically and accurately, and the story arc will shorten." During the Ebola controversy, Texas Health Presbyterian Hospital attempted various public relations strategies, including running ads apologizing for the Ebola misdiagnosis and calling press conferences assuring the public that the hospital was safe.
We know we need to reaffirm the public's trust in us, but we're asking our community to stand with us today.
While the hospital produced testimonials from staff nurses claiming Texas Health Presbyterian was safe,
I feel that I do work in a safe environment.
none of those nurses actually cared for Duncan, and the hospital refused to let any of the staff nurses answer questions from reporters. The staged testimonials and press conferences actually had the opposite effect, prompting more skepticism and distrust from reporters.
Now the nurses made their statement today with no questions allowed and nor explaining why they feel safe and why they are still Presby proud.
When all else failed, and at the urging of a public relations consultant, the hospital finally allowed the staff nurses to speak to the renowned television news program 60 Minutes. For the first time, the public was able to hear a complete account of what happened from the nurses who actually cared for Duncan.
I have nothing but respect and admiration for everyone that was involved in his care. You know, everyone has someone in their lives that they love and they care about. I have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and my wife is pregnant, and the mortality rate for pregnant women with Ebola is essentially 100%.
But Richard, why don't you go to the administration and say, you know, I'm sorry, but my wife is pregnant?
People were allowed to request not to be tasked with his care. But
we asked for volunteers. Everyone volunteered.
Everyone was a volunteer.
Person, housekeeping, respiratory, physicians, nurses.
But despite all the volunteers, Duncan grew worse. An experimental drug wasn't helping.
Early Saturday morning, he had become very critically ill and was placed on a respirator.
He was intubated.
He was intubated.
Tube down his throat.
Tube down his throat. He had a dialysis catheter placed because he was not making the urine that he needed to. He was heavily sedated, and he had tears rolling down his eyes, rolling down his face, and not just a normal watering from a sedated person. This was in the form of tears. And I grabbed a tissue, and I wiped his eyes, and I said, "You're going to be okay. You just get the rest that you need. Let us do the rest for you." And it wasn't 15 minutes later, I couldn't find a pulse. And I lost him. And it was the worst day of my life. This man that we cared for, that fought just as hard with us, lost his fight. And his family couldn't be there. And we were the last 3 people to see him alive. And I was the last one to leave the room. And I held him in my arms. He was alone.